And so just to give you a brief timeline of what is going on in Syria, it all started about March 2000. Well, technically, this has been building up since the early 1900s, but it really came to a head in March 2011 with the Arab Spring protests. Syrian civilians joined in the Arab Spring protests and began amassing in large numbers in Syrian cities to protest the government. Mainly, they were upset with the government's imprisonment of political figures and for the there isn't a democratic government in Syria. It is a semi-presidential government. But however, as I talked about, um, the Syrian government, it's technically supposed to have elections, and I think they do, but they're not. It's basically rigged. Like, for instance, the current president got the presidency from his father. He was never really voted by the populace, so it is not a democratic government at all. And during the protests, actually, security forces fired on protesters, and several protesters died. And so at that point, the protest really began to escalate in violence, and it just took on a whole. It became more than just a protest. Started to become towards the journey to war, and the protests continued for months. And in May of 2011, President Bashar al-Assad ordered tanks to enter cities to quell the uprisings. And it was at that point that Bashar al-Assad decided to use military force to try and suppress the uprisings. And at this point, Bashar al-Assad had also began to bomb cities in Syria. And what happened with that is that a number of rebel forces formed and began to fight back against the government. And one of the forces that formed was the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, this is the force that is actually recognized by the United States, Great Britain, France, Spain, and Turkey as the legitimate government in Syria. And they have received economic and military support from the United States government. And then there's also the Free Syrian Army. ISIS has forces in Syria, and then of course there is President Assad's forces as well. And this war has been most famous mostly for the number of refugees that it has caused to leave the country. And then, so there are a number of objectives for the Syrian Civil War. And it's a type of war, so we said it's a civil war. And the rebel forces' main motivation comes from partly an economic motivation. So, in Syria, unless you are connected with the government, you have a lower socioeconomic standing. There is a huge wealth gap between government employees and the civilians in Syria. In fact, many of the protests actually started out in the poor communities. And then Bashar al-Assad's government is suspected of heavy human rights violations for years, which is partly why you'll understand later on the U.S. involvement in the war. Anyway, the Assad has been accused of imprisoning political prisoners, children, just basically anyone that he says he doesn't like or opposes him, he'll imprison them. He's accused of torture, the use of chemical weapons, and things like that. And then the rebel forces' main goal, specifically the National Coalition's goal, is to establish a democratic government in Syria. When Assad first became president of Syria, he promised to implement a democratic government, but he did not fulfill that promise. And then it's kind of difficult to pinpoint specific motivations for every rebel force, because there are over a dozen different rebel forces that have been identified that are working in Syria. And then, so some of the deterrence that has been issued against Assad's government mainly has come from the U.S., the European Union, and the UN. The U.S., the EU, and the UN have issued economic sanctions against Syria. Specifically, the U.S. has levied economic sanctions against the businesses, the institutions and companies that support Bashar al-Assad's government forces. So, for instance, there is a company in Syria that was responsible for producing the chemical weapons that government forces used against civilians. And so the U.S. levied sanctions against that company to stop them from being able to produce weapons. But the U.S., or the UN, I mean, has stipulated that because Russia and China support Bashar al Assad's government, that until those countries have been sanctioned as well, the sanctions the U.S. have issued haven't really had an effect. So, like, Russia and China have given money and weapons to the government forces in Syria, and there are chemical companies there as well that are helping in the effort to create chemical weapons. And so it's been stipulated the U.S. needs to issue sanctions against those companies in addition. And then, so this war has had a horrible effect on the country of Syria. Firstly, the use of chemical weapons. And it's not just Bashar al Assad's forces that have used chemical weapons, the rebel forces have used chemical weapons as well. So we talked last week about the concept of just war and unjust war. And it started out as a just war from the side of the rebel forces, like back in 2011. But now it's really kind of gone into an unjust war on both sides. Because if you look at the number of casualties that have resulted in the number of refugees and just the human rights violations in the country at this point, the only solution that should be coming about is a ceasefire. Because you can just go online and look up the pictures of children who have been harmed by the use of chemical weapons. And not just children, obviously, like adults have been hurt too. And then there's an estimated over 5 million refugees have had to leave the country since March 2011. Turkey has actually taken in the most refugees. They've actually taken in so many that they can't take anymore, which is why you now see them spilling over into the United States and countries in Europe and the Middle East. And it's estimated that nearly 500,000 people have died since the war began. This includes government forces, rebel forces, and civilians in the country. And then another thing to notice or make mention of is the effect not just on the number of casualties, but the cities as well. I mean, for instance, rebel forces have gone, or like ISIS, they have gone into cities in Syria and have destroyed tons of property. And then the government forces have been bombing and just completely destroying the cities of such as Damascus, Aleppo, and those cities have basically been reduced to rubble, and there's almost nothing left really of Syria except for the land. And this is why there are so many refugees too, not just because of the violence, because their homes have been destroyed and they have nowhere else to live.